In the vast hall of the Shrine Auditorium, thousands of people are present, but no one is truly seeing each other. Everyone is a face, a costume, a role. As the lights flicker on and off, backstage Sylvester James Jr. stares into the mirror. His makeup is flawless, his costume gleaming. But something inside him is broken. Tonight won't be just a show, no one knows it yet, but tonight everything will change. Because sometimes the brightest lights burn to illuminate the darkest truths. The year is 1987, and the Shrine Auditorium pulses with anticipation. Purple and pink lights sweep across thousands of upturned faces, each one hungry for escape, for transcendence, for that electric moment when music becomes more than sound. The disco ball overhead fractures the light into 1,000 shimmering pieces, and in that kaleidoscope of color and shadow, people forget who they are during the day. But no one expected what would shatter the illusion tonight. Do you remember 1978? If you were alive then, you remember when disco wasn't just music, it was freedom incarnate, rebellion wrapped in sequins, liberation set to a 4-on-the-floor beat. Sylvester James Jr. had emerged from the gospel churches of Los Angeles like a phoenix wrapped in feathers and defiance. His voice could climb octaves that seemed to touch heaven itself, a falsetto so pure it made grown men weep and made the marginalized feel seen for the first time in their lives. He had fled the suffocating expectations of his Pentecostal upbringing, where his gender expression was considered a sin, where his very existence was treated as something to be cured or hidden. But Sylvester didn't hide. He exploded. In San Francisco, he found his people. The Cockettes, a theatrical troupe of gender-bending performers, gave him permission to be exactly who he was, flamboyant, fierce, unapologetically himself. By the mid-70s, he was performing in clubs where the Castro Street crowd danced until dawn, where being different wasn't just accepted, it was celebrated. His performances weren't just concerts, they were religious experiences for those who'd been cast out of traditional churches. When he sang, people didn't just hear music. They heard their own stories reflected back at them, their pain acknowledged, their joy validated. 1982 wasn't just the end of disco, it was the beginning of a silent crisis that would claim a generation. The backlash against disco music had an uglier undercurrent that many preferred not to name. When radio stations held disco demolition nights, when they burned records in stadiums, it wasn't just about musical taste. It was about rejecting the queer culture, the black culture, the liberation that disco represented. Our generation watched Sylvester challenge everything society told us about gender, identity, and belonging, even as the walls began to close in around him and his community. By 1985, the disease had a name, but it might as well have been a death sentence. Music historians note that the late 1980s marked a turning point for LGBTQ+ artists navigating public visibility during the AIDS crisis. Sylvester's openness about his identity made him both an icon and a target. Friends were disappearing, vanishing from the clubs and stages they'd once lit up with their presence. The vibrant community that had danced together, created together, survived together, was being systematically erased by an illness that the government seemed content to ignore. Sylvester was fighting a battle no one could see beneath the costumes and the spotlight. He'd received his own diagnosis in 1986, a secret he carried like a weight pressed against his chest every time he stepped on stage. Behind the sequins and heels, Sylvester was hiding his own battle. Not just with illness, but with the question of how to keep performing when the world you'd helped build was crumbling. How do you sing about feeling mighty real when friends are dying and the media treats their deaths as punchlines? How do you embody joy when grief follows you like a shadow? Maybe you've been where Marina was, loss that stops time, grief that isolates, that moment when music is your last hope for feeling anything other than the crushing weight of absence. Marina Cole sat in the VIP section that night, a ticket clutched in her hand like a talisman. She was 43 years old, and 3 years earlier her 8-year-old son had died in an accident that still played on repeat in her nightmares. The grief had hollowed her out, turned her into a ghost moving through the motions of life. Her husband had left, unable to bear the weight of their shared loss. Her friends had stopped calling, exhausted by her inability to move forward. But Sylvester's music had reached her in that dark place. His songs about transformation, about becoming real, about finding strength in vulnerability, they'd been her lifeline. She'd bought this ticket months in advance, convinced that if she could just be in his presence, surrounded by his voice and the collective energy of thousands of other seekers, maybe she could finally feel something other than pain. Marina's ticket was supposed to heal her, instead, it broke her open in ways she never anticipated. The Shrine Auditorium thrummed with bodies pressed together, moving as one organism to the relentless pulse of the bass. Smoke machines created clouds that drifted through colored lights, and in that manufactured mist, people became silhouettes, shadows dancing with other shadows. Sylvester commanded the stage in a glittering bodysuit that caught every beam of light, his backup singers flanking him like warrior angels. The opening notes of his latest song poured through the speakers, and the crowd responded with screams of recognition and joy. In the VIP section, a grieving mother was about to break open in front of everyone. Marina had been swaying, trying to lose herself in the music, trying to let the sound wash away the constant ache. But something went wrong. Instead of feeling uplifted, she felt angry. The happiness surrounding her felt like an accusation, like mockery. All these people dancing, laughing, living, and her son was dead. The injustice of it overwhelmed her. The music that was supposed to save her suddenly felt like a lie, a beautiful lie that promised transcendence but delivered only temporary escape. If you've ever felt invisible in a crowded room, you know what Marina felt building inside her, a pressure that demanded release, a voice that had been swallowed for too long. She stood up. Her hands were shaking. And then, in a moment that would become legend, she shouted over the music, "This is all fake. This music, it's just running from pain." Her voice cut through the synthesizers and the drums, a raw wound exposed in a room full of glitter. Security moved instantly. 3 guards in black polo shirts began threading through the crowd toward her, their faces set in that professional mask of controlled aggression. Standard protocol: remove the disturbance, restore the show. But Sylvester didn't know what was coming would fundamentally alter the trajectory of this night. He heard her voice, heard the pain underneath the words, and something in him recognized it. Something in him saw himself in that breaking woman. And then, the music stopped. Thousands held their breath. Sylvester raised his hand, a simple gesture, but absolute in its authority. The band fell silent. The backing track cut out. In the sudden vacuum of sound, every breath in that massive auditorium became audible. The security guards froze mid-step, confused by the singer's intervention. Close your eyes. Can you hear it? The bass line cutting out, the collective intake of breath, the way silence can be louder than any music when it arrives unexpectedly. What Sylvester said next would echo through music history for decades to come. He walked to the edge of the stage, still lit by the purple and pink spots, and sat down. Not a choreographed move, not part of the show. He sat on the edge of the platform, legs dangling, and for a moment, he was just a man, not a performer. His voice, when it came through the microphone, was soft but carried to every corner of the space. "Stop. Let her speak." The crowd didn't know how to respond. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't what they'd paid for. Marina stood frozen, tears streaming down her face, caught between the guards on one side and a superstar on the other, both focused on her. Sylvester continued, his voice gentle but firm. "Sometimes the voice behind the pain needs to be heard. Sometimes the one who screams is the one who's been silenced the most." Those who attended Shrine Auditorium that night recall a moment of collective silence that felt almost sacred. Concertgoers later described it as the night entertainment became therapy, the night the boundary between performer and audience dissolved completely. Marina began to sob, not delicate tears but the kind of crying that comes from a place too deep for words. Her whole body shook with it, years of suppressed grief finally finding permission to exist. When Sylvester raised his hand, maybe you felt it too, that instinct to protect someone who's breaking, to create space for pain instead of rushing to silence it. He looked at Marina directly, and in that look was understanding, recognition, solidarity. Behind the costume, Sylvester knew what it meant to scream into silence, to perform strength while breaking inside, to smile while carrying unbearable weight. In the silence after Sylvester spoke, someone in the crowd began to clap. Not applause. Rhythm. A slow, steady beat like a heartbeat. Another person joined. Then another. The rhythm spread through the auditorium like wildfire, hands meeting hands, strangers finding tempo together. No one directed it. No one choreographed it. It arose organically as people sought to hold space for Marina's grief together, to create a container for her pain that was bigger than her individual suffering. Have you experienced a moment when music stopped being entertainment and became medicine? When sound transformed into something sacred, something that could hold what words could not? The rhythm built and built, layer upon layer, until thousands of people were creating a single pulse that you could feel in your chest, in your bones. Marina felt the vibration through the floor, through her feet, traveling up her legs and into her heart. For the first time in years, she wasn't alone in her grief. She was part of something larger, held by a collective rhythm that said, "We see you, we hold you, your pain matters." When Marina began to cry harder, the crowd didn't cheer. They leaned in. Other faces in the audience began to glisten with their own tears. Grief is contagious, but so is permission to feel it. Marina's breakdown became everyone's breakthrough. One woman's courage gave thousands permission to hurt openly, to acknowledge the losses they carried, the battles they fought silently. The next words that formed in the collective consciousness needed no voice. Together we hold this, together we heal this, together we transform this. Security had retreated to the edges, uncertain. One guard would later recall, "I've worked hundreds of shows. Never seen an artist protect a heckler before." But it wasn't protection, it was witnessing. That raised hand wasn't just stopping security. It was stopping a culture that silences pain, that demands we perform happiness, that treats vulnerability as weakness rather than the most courageous act possible. Backstage crew members stood in the wings, mascara running, equipment forgotten. They'd set up lights and sound for a disco show. They hadn't expected to participate in a mass healing ritual. Sylvester sat on that stage edge, microphone hanging loosely in his hand, and let the rhythm the audience created wash over him. He was crying too, though most couldn't see it from the back rows. In that moment, he wasn't Sylvester the legend. He was a man with his own diagnosis, his own terror, his own grief for friends lost and time running short. As the rhythm built again, something ancient awakened in that space, something that predated disco, predated recorded music, that reached back to the first humans who gathered around fires and used sound to process the incomprehensible. When Sylvester finally stood, when he nodded to his band, when the opening notes of his song began again, it wasn't a performance anymore. It was prayer set to a beat, collective sorrow and hope made audible. The music that poured through the speakers was the same song, the same notes, but everything had changed. The audience didn't dance the way they had before. They swayed like trees in wind, like a congregation moved by spirit. Marina was still standing, still crying, but now she was surrounded by strangers who'd turned toward her, who included her in their movement, who made space for her in their rhythm. The disco ball still turned overhead, fracturing light into infinite pieces, but now each shard felt like a tiny prayer, a small piece of hope scattered across darkness. Your children might stream disco playlists today, but they'll never know what it meant to dance when dancing was rebellion, to claim joy when the world insisted you had no right to it, to create community when society said you didn't deserve one. Music wasn't just sound waves that night. It became a container for collective sorrow and hope, a vehicle for transformation that connected every person in that space to their own humanity and to each other's. Decades later, neuroscientists would explain it. Synchronized rhythm creates neural bonding, releases oxytocin, forges temporary tribal connections that can heal trauma. But that night, they just felt it. They felt the way individual pain could be held by a community, the way music could create a space where it was safe to fall apart because you knew you'd be caught. According to witnesses from that era, the spontaneous rhythm that emerged from the crowd wasn't planned or rehearsed, it arose organically as people sought to hold space for Marina's grief together, to transform a concert hall into a sanctuary where pain was welcomed rather than expelled. When the song ended, there was no wild applause. There was reverent silence, then a wave of emotion that moved through the crowd like wind through grass. People hugged strangers. They wept openly. They shared stories of their own losses, their own battles, their own reasons for needing Sylvester's music to survive. That night didn't just change Marina, it changed everyone who witnessed it. Those who were there would carry the memory for the rest of their lives, would tell their children and grandchildren about the night a disco show became a collective healing ritual. Marina left the Shrine Auditorium different than when she'd entered. The grief was still there, grief that deep doesn't disappear, but it had been witnessed, validated, shared. She was no longer alone in it. Backstage after the show, crew members found Sylvester sitting in his dressing room, makeup streaked with tears, still in his costume but somehow looking more naked than if he'd been bare. He didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, it was to say something that would stick with everyone who heard it. "I thought I was here to make people forget their pain. Tonight I learned I'm here to help them remember they're not alone in it." We all remember where we were when we lost Sylvester in 1988. The Castro Street vigils, the thousands who lined the streets, the silence that followed the loss of a voice that had given so many people permission to exist fully. But those who'd been at Shrine Auditorium that night in 1987 carried a different memory. They remembered not just the performer, but the human. Not just the legend, but the man who chose to stop a show because he heard genuine pain and refused to ignore it. Think about your own struggles in those years. The friends you lost. The battles you fought quietly while the government looked away and the media made jokes. The way certain communities came together not because it was easy but because survival demanded it. Sylvester wasn't invincible, though he seemed that way under the lights. He was a man who chose vulnerability over performance, connection over perfection, humanity over spectacle. Years later, those who were there would say, "That night, we stopped watching a star. We started seeing a soul." The night disco became church wasn't planned or marketed. It happened because one woman's pain met one artist's compassion and thousands of people chose to participate in something larger than entertainment. When music returned after that silence, it wasn't a song anymore, it was prayer, meditation, collective acknowledgement that we're all breaking in different ways and we all deserve to be held in our breaking. Sylvester didn't just perform that night. He witnessed. And in witnessing, he healed both others and himself. The AIDS crisis would claim him 16 months later, but the lesson of that night persisted. Music historians and cultural critics would spend decades analyzing the cultural impact of disco, the political dimensions of dance music, the ways that LGBTQ+ artists used performance to carve out spaces of freedom in hostile environments. But sometimes the most profound impact happens in a single moment, when one person chooses compassion over convenience, when an artist remembers that before they were a performer, they were human. Marina's tears weren't weakness that night. They were years of suppressed grief finally finding permission, finally needing a space large enough to hold them. One woman's courage gave thousands permission to hurt openly, to bring their whole selves, broken parts included, into a space that usually demanded only joy and celebration. The real reason she spoke wasn't anger at Sylvester. It was anger at a world that kept spinning after her son stopped breathing, anger at a culture that expected her to move on, to get over it, to perform normalcy. If this story moved you, if you remember those disco nights when dancing wasn't just recreation but necessary survival, if you've ever been saved by a song or healed by a community that formed around sound, carry this forward. Carry the memory that entertainment can become medicine, that performance can become prayer, that the most profound act an artist can offer isn't perfection but presence. One night. One woman. One truth. And in that collision of pain and compassion, something sacred emerged that transcended music, transcended performance, transcended the boundaries we usually maintain between artist and audience, between individual suffering and collective healing. The Shrine Auditorium had hosted countless concerts before that night and would host countless more after. But those who were there knew they'd witnessed something that happened only once, the night a superstar remembered he was human, and in remembering, gave everyone permission to be human too.